Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video. In this video, I'm back with another BBUS ranking, one that I did say I was going to do. And here we'll be ranking every cast in the history of the show. Now, I've already done this for Survivor US, and this will be a similar list of ranking of the casts of each main series season based on how entertaining / iconic / memorable they are. Again, the criteria is a bit wonky if I'm being honest, but this will not be based around gameplay. This is not the casts that I think are the best at the game. This is more so an assessment of how notable these casts are in the grand scheme of things. Now, usually with my Big Brother rankings, I do leave Big Brother 1 out of it. However, because this is more of a cast ranking and not one assessing any style of gameplay, I will be including BB1 here, so that's something. Also beyond that, I will not be including the likes of Celebrity Big Brother or BBOTT, and this will only be main series seasons, though I do feel like each of them have pretty solid casts with the exception of Celebrity Big Brother 3, but we don't talk about that. But again, this will just be main seasons of the show, so we do have 24 seasons to rank here. Starting it off at the bottom, number 24, the worst cast in the history of Big Brother. Really shocking here, it does end up being Big Brother 1. And straight up, obviously this is a massive bias on my end in the sense that I did not enjoy Big Brother 1. I've only watched Big Brother 1 once, I believe around 10 years ago, if not more at this point. And while I did do a level of research for this video in rewatching clips from Big Brother 1 to remind myself of each of the cast members, really still none of them really stand out that much. And that is the issue of Big Brother 1, is just how boring the show was, and a lot of it came from the fact that the cast was simply just not likable or not really notable in any particular way. Like, obviously you have the likes of Chicken George, who really, I feel like I remember much more of him from Big Brother 7 than I do from Big Brother 1, despite the fact that on Big Brother 1, he technically gets more airtime. Will Mega is a very notable character if you've watched Big Brother 1, however, he's also the first boot of the season. And beyond that, so many other figures are just simply unnotable. Or maybe has like one thing about them that sticks out in your mind. You have the likes of Jordan, who was a stripper. You have the likes of Karen, who didn't love her husband. You have the likes of Cassandra, who was the first ever black woman in the show. You have Eddie, the winner, who didn't have a leg. You have Josh, who I feel like I remember more so for his relationships outside of the show. Jamie, I feel like I know more about her from outside the show than I knew from her inside the show. You have Curtis, who was fine. Brittany was kind of notable, but really outside that, again, a very just blah cast. The cast of people that just simply does not stick to your mind, even if you watched it. And because of that, for me, it's at the bottom here. Now, number 23. This is going to be a very interesting pick because if you watch my Survivor video, I didn't mention that for Survivor, like the All-Star seasons are typically higher on the list, even if they are mediocre seasons, just due to the prestige that the cast has. However, I feel like with Big Brother, when putting this list together, I didn't feel that level of attachment. Maybe it's because Big Brother does have less returnee seasons and just less returnees in general, to where there are like a lot more one-time players that are super notable, to where it makes it feel like returnee seasons are less important. But straight up, we're already at a returnee season, and at number 23, the second worst cast for me ends up being Big Brother 22. Now, this is an interesting spot because, again, I was actually high on the Big Brother 22 cast coming into it. I do think, considering all the restraints that they had in terms of who would have said yes at that specific time, I do think they put together a competent cast, and I do think overall prestige of the cast is fine. My issue with the cast is more so what they did with the cast, is the fact that, like, on the actual season, I feel like very few of these people actually boosted their legacies, especially when we're talking about from a more entertainment standpoint. I feel like none of the people on the season actually did anything to become more notable figures in the grand scheme of things. Maybe the likes of Davon, obviously Cody, Enzo, and Nicole like make it far into the game and bolster their legacies in the grand scheme of the show. But I think like as a character on this show, it simply just did not work. And again, that was because the gameplay was so stagnant throughout a lot of it that it really made it boring. But I really feel like the players were not having fun on this season. And through that, it really just makes the events of Big Brother 22 just not stick to my mind. Like, I feel like there are very few positives from Big Brother 22 that stick to my mind. So again, while there are people on this cast that are great on paper, I mean, you obviously have the return of Kaser and Janelle, which is still probably one of the best parts of the entire season. You have like the return of Keisha, but again, didn't get much to do on this season. You get the return of Ian, also didn't have that much to do on this season. You have the return of Kevin Campbell, also didn't get that much to do on this season. Tyler obviously ended up being underwhelming. You also have the questionable casting choice of someone like a Christmas, and Nicole Anthony didn't bring much to the table. Memphis was very polarizing. Danny Donato came off as less likable. Also, we had David, and that is something. So it's like, again, like, even though this is an all-star season, and through that you would think that the cast would be ranked pretty high, I don't feel like the cast had much to do on this season due to how stagnant the gameplay is and how little fun it felt like the cast was having during the season. To where, again, really for me, the only notable characters in terms of what they did on this individual season are really like Devon, maybe Enzo, and then the returns of Janelle and Kaser, which for me is really just not enough to put it higher than most other seasons, and because that's here at number 23. And number 22, moving on to another season in the 20s, we're moving on to BB21. And I actually assumed that this was going to be at the bottom, and to be honest, I can definitely see the argument for it. I do think BB21 is a cast that just simply came off as really unlikable from the very beginning. However, the reason I do have it above 22 is I do feel like the cast had more to do across the season. Also, I feel like a lot of the earlier boots at least stood out a bit. I mean, again, like, I think in terms of the end gamers, you had Nicole Anthony and Cliff, who came off as more likable. Tommy was fine, even though a bit of a ham. You have Christy, who I think came off as unlikable at points, but at least had really fun content along the way. Jackson winning is still a bit rough, but I do think the way that he wins, though, kind of adds to the appeal of his story there. And again, a lot of the earlier boots for me were pretty solid. Again, you have like David, who came off as likable on this season. Ovi was likable. Kemi was likable. Bella wasn't likable, but was an extremely messy player. Sam, again, ruined his reputation post-show, but at least on the show, had fun moments, particularly towards the end of his run. Kat was a fun presence as well. So again, it's not all bad, but again, you do have the really unlikable figures like Jack and Nick, Jackson, the likes of Holly and Annalise didn't bring that much to the table. But again, on paper, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that bad of a cast. It's more so just a cast that has this really negative taint to it, to where because that for me, it lands here at 22. Now 21, we have a cast that I said at the time I did not like, and I'm sticking by it at this point. At 21, we do have the most recent cast of the show. We have BB24. And BB24, again, has two pretty massive standouts, I feel like. One extremely massive standout, obviously, in Taylor, who is undeniably the star of the season. And then you have Michael, who is another one of the more major characters, who obviously broke comp records, and that's notable. Outside of that, I think we're really struggling. I mean, we do got, I guess, Turner and Jasmine, who had fun character moments on the show. But again, like, just a lot of this cast comes off as extremely unlikable. I mean, a lot of the pre-mergers, despite them not ending up being bad characters, the likes of Paloma and Pooch and Amira, Nicole, Daniel, like, all of them came off as just so unlikable. Though I will say, again, like I've said this at the time, I do think the downfalls of these people were great to see, particularly the likes of Nicole and Daniel. I do think seeing their downfalls was really, really great TV. I do think it adds to the cast a bit, to where it makes them a bit more palatable, but again, still not by much. Again, you have a lot of people that make it a bit deeper into the game that don't really get much to do. The people like a Terrence, people like an Indy, even Alyssa, like, while she is the catalyst for a lot of the game, she herself doesn't really do much across the season. Brittany is an interesting character, though I feel like on the show itself, she didn't really get that much screen time until the tail end of the season. Monty is really boring. Obviously, like, so Kyle has this like icky feeling around him, and at that point we have like a Joseph, who's again likable, but also not the most riveting TV. So again, like, for me, it's kind of a middling cast. Also has a negative taint against it, though obviously has the massive star in Taylor that I do think elevates it above BB21 to where it is here at number 21. Now number 20, moving on to another cast, extremely negative taint surrounding all of it, though I do think it's a better cast than people say, though again, not necessarily from a gameplay perspective, and that is the cast of BB19. Now BB19, again, obviously has the negative taint of this being a season where Paul dominated the game and did it through a lot of bullying tactics, and the players in the house just treated each other really terribly, and that's obviously a major factor here that leads to some negativity. However, I feel like out of that, you do get some pretty big characters. Again, Paul himself is obviously a massive character. Josh, again, say what you will about him in terms of how annoying he is. He's an incredible character. Jess and Cody were great antagonists to Paul across this season. And again, Cody himself, not the most likable presence in the world, but again, like as this foil to Paul, I do feel like he plays his role there. I thought Mark was a likable underdog at the time. You obviously have some more of the unlikable people in Raven and Alex, but I still feel like they made for good TV. Raven in particular, like her delusions in the game were just really funny. Matt Kleins, again, one of the most boring people in history of the show, but still, his freak out against Jason when he was on his way out was just hilarious. And I feel like that's another aspect I remember from this season is just how great the jury house was. To where in the jury house we have like a lot of fighting between Matt and Raven and Mark and Jason. Like all that stuff is really, really great. That kind of propels the season's cast in my eyes. Though I will say I do think a lot of the earlier boots are kind of just nobodies. I mean, the likes of Megan and Jillian. Cameron obviously doesn't get much to do. Dominique didn't really get that much to do on the show. Ramses didn't get much to do on the show. Elena never came off as particularly likable. Even Kevin doesn't really have that much to do, even though he did come off as likable at points. But again, like overall, I do think it's a very mixed cast. I do have it above the last few we talked about because again, I do think there are some all-time great characters on here with the likes of Josh, Paul, Jess, and Cody. But it's again the negative taint on it and also some really lackluster early boots that do leave it towards the bottom at number 20. Now number 19, another season, still a season that has a lot of negativity surrounding it, though one from way further back. We're going to Big Brother 4. And Big Brother 4 for me, again, another one. Early boots, not super notable. The likes of Michelle and Amanda. And I guess we can add David Lane to all this. The first two people to have sex in Big Brother, but it's like, again, is that interesting? Scott has an interesting expulsion from the game. Deeper in the season, the likes of like a Justin is largely just fine. Like even some endgamers and like an Erica, she's fine on this season. Doesn't really end up being that notable to me. Obviously until her All-Stars run, and even some of the other people like just simply do not come off as likable. I mean, like Robert is extremely unlikable despite him being somewhat notable across this season. Someone like a Dana is also not particularly likable despite being a big character. Though I did find Jack and G both pretty interesting figures for a show. Definitely casting choices you don't see in the modern day. But I mean, obviously the two stars of the season are the final two in June and Allison, who in themselves have a lot of negativity surrounding them. They say some terrible things across this season, but still do end up becoming the stars of this season. And I do think the legacy of them as a final two, an all-female final two, of two pretty competent players, I do think definitely adds to the legacy of this cast. But I do think at the end of the day, I can't really put this cast too much higher because of how much a lot of these people just simply do not come off as likable. And because I do have to land it here at number 19. Now number 18, probably a cast people have been expecting for a little bit, and that is the cast of Big Brother 15. Obviously a cast completely surrounded in negativity. However, I do feel like it's a cast that feels very different from a lot of other Big Brother casts. Obviously not talking about the racism, which again, through that, obviously makes a lot of figures on the season extremely unlikable. However, I do feel like this is one of the most game-savvy casts that Big Brother has ever had. Where obviously you have massive outliers here, and someone like a Gina Marie, and someone like a David Gurton, but outside of that, I feel like everyone else is a pretty competent player. But again, it's obviously like racism harms the season as a whole, makes a lot of these people super unlikable. Again, Gina Marie in particular, Aaron, Amanda suffers from that negativity, even though she does end up becoming one of the biggest characters of the season. But also, again, some of the earlier boots and David and Jeremy kind of fall into that as well. But I think through that, on the opposite side of things, you have some of the more likable figures across this season. You have Candace and Howard, who their perseverance through that negativity is a really interesting storyline here. You have the likes of Helen and Alyssa, who were also more likable figures. Andy is someone that, again, like on the show was pretty purple for the first half of it. But even then, I do find him to be an interesting player to watch across this season. Judd is a really big character and always a pretty likable figure there. I've always liked Jesse Kowalski personally, so that's the thing. I don't know, again, like overall, like it is a season greatly harmed by the racist behavior, and through that does severely knock this cast down. However, I will say I do have a bit of attachment to the season, considering I watched the feeds of the season probably the most out of any other Big Brother US season, so that's obviously a factor here. And then also did find this cast to be pretty good TV when racist stuff wasn't happening on screen. So again, because of that, for me, it lands here at number 18. At number 17, another cast that, again, still has a negative taint around it. We're still kind of in that tier, but a cast that obviously has some all-time great characters. At number 17, we do have Big Brother 8. And obviously the big standout / also negative presence across the season is Evil Dick. And I'm of two minds on this. I mean, Evil Dick, again, would not be able to get away with what he did on that season. Nowadays is really terrible behavior. But at the time, I mean, it did make for good TV. I mean, it did make for a lot of drama on the show. And it also led to an interesting storyline with him and Danielle and them getting to the final two together, no matter how manufactured that was. But obviously, this is the star of Danny Donato's run, and she's a notable figure. You have Eric Stein, who I've always really liked, that's on this season. You have Jen Johnson, who's an incredible character as well. I think the issue is that most of the other cast members are not super memorable. I mean, a lot of the earlier boots are super forgettable. I mean, who is Mike Dutz? Who is Carol? Who is Joe, who I guess is maybe a little bit more memorable, but Nick is someone that I think is pretty much only memorable because of his relationship to Danielle and Jen. Dustin, I feel like, is mostly memorable nowadays just because of his blind side. Amber is notable because of her crying. Jessica is fine. You have Jamaica, who is probably a forgotten about character at this point. And then you have Zach, who is extremely boring, but still gets all the way to final three. Like, again, like, it's a very middling cast outside of the really big names in like Dick, Danielle, Eric, and Jen, and also has the negativity surrounding it and all of the screen time that Dick gets across the season. But I do feel like it still led to an entertaining season. But I do still feel like this cast as a whole was still mostly entertaining, and because of that, for me, it's here at number 17. Now number 16, this is also probably a very unpopular opinion. At number 16, I have the last cast on this list that's kind of in this grouping of negatively tainted seasons, and here we do have Big Brother 9. Again, I have always been a defender of Big Brother 9 to a degree. I mean, while it's not particularly high on my season ranking, it is actually one of my most watched seasons of the show. It is a season that I loved when I originally watched it. Again, there is a lot of terrible behavior across this season. There's a lot of unlikable figures across this season. But despite that, it's also one of the funniest seasons of the show. I think it is a season with some really incredible character moments throughout it. I think the winner in Adam, again, someone that I think is largely forgotten about, or if he is remembered, he's remembered more for his drug ring immediately after the season. Adam is actually an incredible character on the show. Probably one of the funniest winners the show has ever seen. Outside of that, you have the story arc of James, who I think gets a really fun underdog run across the season. You have someone like a Sheila, who has a fun arc. Natalie is a really big character. Maddie is a really big character. A lot of the early boots have really big storylines. The likes of Jen and Parker, the likes of Alex and Amanda. Chelsea and Joshua are massive characters as well, though, to be fair, a lot of negativity surrounding them as well. But again, I personally do find myself really entertained by this cast, largely because of how much drama and how many ridiculous things happen across this season. Again, yes, the negativity definitely harms it, which is why it's still this low on the list, but I do think it is a better cast than people give it credit for. I do think it is a more humorous cast, a cast that kind of reminds me of like something like a Survivor Gabon, and because that for me, it's here number 16. Now number 15, we're kind of out of the more unlikable cast and now getting into some of the more palatable casts, but still ones that don't massively stand out. And at number 15, we're going to season 16. And 16's a massive mixed bag of a cast to me. I do think half the cast is really strong. However, also half the cast is really mediocre. Again, the likes of Joey, Pow Pow, Brittany, Amber B, despite her later challenge run, Jocasta, even a Hayden Voss, and obviously Victoria. Like, they are mostly duds across this season. However, despite that, you obviously have some all-time great characters and someone like a Donnie, a Zach. Devin has a spectacular downfall. You have legendary figures in a Derek and a Cody. You have Frankie Grande. You have Beast Mode Cowboy, which despite his negativity is still a fun character. You have the first appearance of Nicole Franzel. Christine ends up having an interesting run across the season. Again, like, it is a cast kind of two tales, where again, like, half of it is actually a pretty solid cast, but the other half is really forgettable. And like, again, combining those two things together kind of leaves it as a very middling cast in my eyes, and it's here at number 15. 13. Now number 14, moving on to a cast that I think people are probably expecting to be higher, considering how noted this season is as one of the best modern seasons of the show. However, I do think its cast is actually not as good as most people say. At number 14, we do have season 17. And 17's cast for me is, again, extremely top heavy. You obviously have the likes of Vanessa, of Johnny Mac, of Austin, who gets a great downfall. I think those three are incredible casting choices. You obviously have Devon as an early boot. That's incredible. You have Audrey, who is a really notable early boot. You have someone like a Shelley Poole, who is kind of a notable early-ish boot. James is a big character. But for me, that's really it. I mean, yes, you have Liz and Julia, who do bring some humor to the show here and there. Jason is kind of a fine earlier boot, but really outside that, I mean, this cast is pretty lacking. I mean, even the Winter and Steve is just almost invisible for a lot of the season, and even when he's there, he's not particularly entertaining. You have a lot of under-edited people that make it to the mid portion of the game, people like a Meg and a Becky and a Jackie who have very little to do on the show. You have Jeff Weldon, who is a person that played Big Brother and Amazing Race somehow. Jace is a fine first boot, but again, not super notable in the grand scheme of things. You have Clay, who is also mostly boring, and if it wasn't for his connection to Shelley, I think it would be mostly forgettable. Again, like, it is a cast that, again, like, has some all-time great characters in Vanessa, Johnny Mac, and Austin. Also has the likes of Devon and James, who obviously come back again, but outside that, not the greatest cast for me in the world, mainly because of its inconsistency and because that is here number 14. Now number 13, we're moving on to another very inconsistent cast, and that is the cast of season 14. And 14's another one. You have some all-time great figures on this season. You have Dan and Ian, the final two of the biggest characters across the season. You have the story of Frank. His underdog run is really notable across the season. You have returnees here in Brittany, Janelle, and Boogie, each of which brings something to the table. But outside of that, I do think a lot of the newbie field here is kind of lacking. While I think very few of them bring absolutely nothing to the table, a lot of them just don't come off as super memorable. And Danielle Murphy is someone that is probably the most notable of those, outside of Ian, obviously, though even she wasn't particularly likable. Shane was just mostly boring. Jen was also mostly boring. Joe had some humorous moments here and there, but again, not a particularly prominent figure across the season. Ashley, again, also some humorous moments, but not that notable in the grand scheme of things. Will, I think, got severely under-edited. JoJo doesn't get much to do here. Kara doesn't get much to do. Jody, obviously, is the first boot. Jody's obviously booted right away. And then we got Willie Hantz, who is Willie Hantz. So again, like, it's a very middling cast. I do think it's a cast that as a whole, again, is around the same level of quality as the last few. However, I do think having the likes of Ian, Dan, and Frank all having incredible runs on this season, with obviously Dan and Ian being two all-time great characters on this season, really elevates it above the last few we talked about, and it's here number 13. Now number 12, moving on to another season with some returnees, and as the season right before it, we're moving on to BB13. And BB13 has a very similar issue. However, I will say I do think the newbies on this season are slightly better. While you still have someone like a Portia who doesn't bring much to the table despite getting all the way to second place, or someone like a Cassie who doesn't get much to do, but I think the likes of Keith had a really fun downfall. Lawan has a really great downfall. Dominic comes off as a really likable presence. Adam is Adam, but Shelley ends up being an interesting player across the season. Kalia ends up being a big figure. So I feel like there's a bit more consistency within the newbie field here, and then when we're talking about the vet field, again, there's still some great characters here. I mean, Rachel obviously wins the season, and that's really just insane. But she's an incredible character. Jeff has an incredible downfall on this season that's really fun to watch. You have this really great underdog run from Daniel Donato, and that's really fun to watch as well. Jordan also becomes a more interesting character after Jeff ends up leaving. Brendan is fine on this season. I don't think as good as on BB12, but still solid here. So again, like, it's overall, like, again, a solid cast for me. I think it's more consistent through and through than 14. I feel like there's not really a single, like, true dud on this cast, though still has a level of inconsistency that leaves it outside the top cast of all time. And that's why it's here number 12. Now number 11, moving on to a bit of an older school season of the show. We've actually surprisingly not talked about many old school seasons of the show at this point. But at number 11, we're going to Big Brother 5. And Big Brother 5, again, another pretty inconsistent cast in my eyes. though again, has some legendary figures. You got Diane, you got Nokomis, you got the likes of Marvin, who are all really great characters, and despite them not really standing the test of time, in terms of being figures that are still mentioned a lot in the modern day, I think at the time they were incredible TV. Also, Jace, I think at the time ends up becoming one of the most notable early boots in history of Big Brother, really just dominating the screen time up until his eventual boot, and his downfall is just incredible TV. Also have the likes of someone like a Cowboy, who was an interesting character, though again questionable on how much he was really that likable. Karen is again another person that's mostly forgettable nowadays, but at the time had a lot of funny confessionals. Someone like a Scott, similar thing as Jace. Interesting downfall there. The winner in Drew is mostly boring, but I mean, again, the fact that he cuts Diane at the end is an interesting moment there. And the problem is that, again, there are still a decent amount of forgettable figures. I mean, the likes of Lori and Will and even Holly don't really stand the test of time. You have Adrian and Natalie, who just come off as extremely unlikable. Mike Lubinsky is an interesting first boot, but at the end of the day, doesn't bring that much there. So again, I feel like those things kind of knock the season down a bit, but again, at the end of the day, it is still a pretty entertaining cast, and because of that, for me, it's here at number 11. Now we're at the top 10, and we're starting that off moving back to more modern seasons. At number 10, we do have Big Brother 20, which again is a season that I've always liked, and I think this is another season that doesn't really have a true dud across the season. I think everyone on the season brings something to the table, though also I think it struggles to really elevate to having too many truly iconic figures on the season, where really I feel like the entire season is based around the story of Tyler, and he's obviously like the major focus of the season, but even within that, he's more so the straight man, where he himself is like not that interesting. It's more so how he reacts to the people around him that makes him interesting. But again, we do get someone like a JC, who again is not the most likable presence, but is definitely a really interesting character there. You have someone like a Brett, who ends up becoming a much more likable character than you would have expected him to be. Fessy ends up being an interesting character, largely due to how terrible of a player he ends up being across this season. Haley ends up becoming a somewhat likable figure as well, considering she's on the bottom for a lot of it. A lot of the earlier boots end up becoming interesting figures. People like a Swaggy C and a Caitlyn and a Bailey, all of which have fantastic downfalls. While the likes of someone like a Rachel Swindler and a Winston really didn't bring that much to the table. Their eventual blindsides end up being really big moments for the season. You obviously have Rockstar and her daughter's birthday, and all that is incredible TV. I still think it's a cast that is mostly mixed in the grand scheme of things, though I think the fact that there isn't like a single person that I think is a true dud, and the fact that I think literally every person on the season at least brings something to the table, or even the less notable figures end up being part of like massive blindsides across the season, I think that definitely helps out the season's legacy, where I do have this cast here at number 10. Now, number 9, we're moving on to the most recent cast left on the board, a cast I really liked at the time, despite the season not turning out as interesting as it could have been, and that is the cast of Big Brother 23. Again, the cast 23 has always been really great in my eyes. Again, while the season as a whole obviously ends up becoming more so the story of the cookout, ends up being a very happy-go-lucky season with very little drama throughout it, the cast itself is still incredible. Like, really, outside of Travis and maybe Whitney, I feel like literally everyone here is a pretty good character for the show. Like, even someone like a Brent, who isn't very likable at all, but still has a really interesting downfall across the season. You have some likable presences that go early, like a Brittany and a Christian. I know SB was hated at the time, however, I always found her to be an interesting player in the game. Claire was someone I saw in a similar light. DX obviously ends up becoming a very likable presence. And Frenchie obviously has a massive downfall across those first 2 weeks, but do make those first 2 weeks as great as they are. And then we obviously have the Cookout, which is a group of very interesting figures, where again, despite their formation and stagnation of the gameplay causing the season as a whole to be largely middling in my eyes, I did really like this group of people. I mean, Tiffany and Hannah are two really likable figures there, though to be fair, it does play into the disappointments with the outcome of the season, the fact that they are the first two out of the Cookout. But again, like even Xavier, despite his delusions while in the game, was still a very likable presence. Kyland is someone that is less likable, but at least had a really satisfying downfall. And obviously has the great confrontation with Xavier on his way out. And then you got Big D and Azza, who are, like, to me, probably the lesser members of the Cookout, but even then, Azza was still a very likable presence. Big D, not as much, but again, his delusions at least brought something to the table. So again, like for me, I do think this is overall a really strong cast, especially for modern standards, and because that is here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're actually moving to the last cast on the board within the second half of Big Brother at this current point in time, which is actually extremely sad when you think about it. But here we're actually moving on to a season that I think most people would not put this high, and that is Big Brother 18. And again, I've always been a supporter of Big Brother 18. I do think Big B 18 is a better season than many people say, and I do think its cast is a lot of the reason for that. Yeah, I do think it's another one of these casts that doesn't have a single dud across the entire season. It's like, yes, there are some less notable figures, people like a Bronte and maybe a Zakiya, and Bridget didn't end up doing that much until the very end of her run. Corey is kind of boring. But outside that, I feel like everyone else is a pretty good figure for the show. Again, Jose has a fantastic downfall. Tiffany ends up becoming a massive character before she ends up going out. Frank has a fantastic downfall across the season. Devon is a massive character on the season. Big Meech ends up being a funny figure. Natalie Negrati plays a big role on the season. James is a bit of a shell of his BB17 version of himself, but it's still not completely unentertaining. Nicole Franzel ends up playing a much more cutthroat game this season. That's interesting to see. And then we have some all-time great characters where, as much as people don't like him, Paulie Calafiore has one of the best downfalls in the history of Big Brother, and that is incredible to watch here. And you also have the likes of Paul and Victor, who are extremely likable on this season towards the end, to where they had these massive underdog runs, and that was really great to see. So again, like for me, I just feel like BB18 is kind of an understated cast. Like, while it's not an elite cast, again, still at number 8 out of 24, I do think it's a better cast than people give it credit for. But again, some all-time great characters in the likes of Paul, Devon, and Paulie. Also, some interesting returns from the likes of Nicole, Frank, and James, while also having some pretty notable early boots, which leaves it as, again, like a pretty consistent cast through and through. So because that for me, it's here at number 8. Now number 7, and for me, this is essentially the top tier of the list. I feel like these were all the casts that I did consider to be actually good casts of Big Brother. However, we're starting out at number 7, and this is a weird one because I always actually assumed that this would be towards the top. I always assumed that this would probably be number 1 or number 2. However, we're here where this is number 7, and that is the cast of Big Brother 7, Big Brother All-Stars, which again is so weird to have the first ever All-Star cast this low on the list. And again, a lot of that comes from, again, like I just feel like there's less gravitas put into these returnee seasons for Big Brother to me, to where through that it doesn't really add too much when we have these all-star seasons in comparison to Survivor, where again, you look at the original Survivor All-Stars, and that season really had the who's who, had all the biggest names, not just in terms of legacy, but also in terms of gameplay, where I feel like Big Brother here has a lot of the big names in terms of legacy, but not really anyone, but very few in terms of gameplay, where again, like looking at this cast, it's like, yeah, you do have the likes of Will and Janelle, and really through that, just the entire Sovereign Six were massive figures at the time. You have the return of Marcellus and Danielle Reyes, but really, that's kind of it. I mean, yes, the likes of like a Diane and a Nokomis and a Allison were big returnees, but they also didn't get much to do on this season. They were all early boots, and really they just felt like shells of their original selves. And really, I feel like that's really a massive flaw of just this entire season, is that I feel like this is a cast that, while it's like fine on paper as an all-star cast, I feel like very few people do much to actually boon their legacy. We're again running through it. Again, we have the likes of Allison and Nokomis and Diane and even Kaser, even Marcellus, even Howie. Like, I feel like none of them do much to actually boon their legacy outside of just them appearing on an all-star season. Jace probably improves his legacy to a degree, but again, like, he technically also becomes a 2-time pre-merge boot and actually does worse technically on the return, even though I think he probably played better. James kind of just like solidifies his legacy, like he's really just mostly the same on the return. I mean, you have the likes of Chicken George, who, yeah, that's something. Even Erica, who gets second, like I don't feel like she has that much to do across this season. So at that point, like we're leaving it with what? Danielle Reyes, Janelle, Will, and Boogie as people who increased their legacies. Like that's really just not that much, especially for an all-star season here. To where again, I really like BB7. It is still one of my favorite seasons of all time. However, I do feel like the casting of it is still pretty middling. So despite me initially thinking it would be at the very top of the list, instead it does end up becoming a bit below that at number 7. Now number 6, moving on to, what do you know, another season that matches with its placement. We're at BB6. And BB6, I will say, is like maybe a smidge inconsistent. It is obviously a very iconic season, one that has very iconic characters. However, I think through that, there are a few lesser figures early on. Mind you, I still think they do mostly boon the season, with the exception of Ashlea, who was there. Again, like someone like a Michael ends up being Janelle's showmance, and that's somewhat notable, I guess. You have Sarah, who has the interesting storyline with James, but again, her herself doesn't have that much to do. Even some later boots like a Bo, even like a Rachel, I feel like didn't get that much to do. But again, everyone else has pretty great storylines across the season. We obviously have all-time great characters in the likes of Janelle and Kaser and James. We have Howie there, who is someone that hasn't aged particularly well, but I do think his role on the season was pretty fun at the time. You have Yvette, who also, despite being kind of unlikable, is also a really big character. April ends up being a pretty interesting character on the season. Jennifer has a really fun downfall in the season. You have Cappy, who is, again, despite maybe not being the most likable presence, is definitely a super notable early boots. And then we have the likes of Maggie, who I think is pretty boring, if I'm being honest, but at least plays the game in a very interesting way to watch. So again, like, I think as a whole, BB6's cast is pretty good, though I do think it's that smidge of a consistency that leaves it below the cast that we're going to be talking about in a bit, and because of that, it is here at number 6. Now number 5, we're moving on to a cast that I feel like I never hear people talk about as an all-time great cast. However, I always really like this cast, and again, there is some bias here in the fact that this is the season that got me back into Big Brother, but I've always really liked this cast, and that is the cast of Big Brother 11. And Big Brother 11 is another season that does have a pretty weak first boot, that being Brayden, who is extremely unlikable. But outside of that, I think the rest of the cast is pretty good. I mean, you do have the likes of Laura and Casey, who are somewhat entertaining early boots. You have really entertaining boots after that in the likes of a Ronnie, who causes a lot of drama. Jesse obviously ends up becoming a massive presence across the season. Shima ends up becoming a really massive presence that I remember at the time I really disliked Shima, though in retrospect I think she's definitely a lot more likable there. You have Lydia, who ends up being a really chaotic figure as well. Kevin Campbell is a pretty likable figure. Michelle Noonan is also a really interesting character to watch. You also have the story of Jeff and Jordan, to where, again, like Jeff, not the most likable in the modern day, though at the time was obviously a massive figure for the show, and again, his downfall here is still fun to watch. You have Natalie, who is largely unlikable, but still brings some entertainment to the show through a lot of the ridiculousness of her. And then we have my favorite character of the entire season in Russell, who I just adored Russell back in the day. I mean, he was definitely my favorite character when I was watching the show the first time around. And even now, I still think he brings a lot of entertainment to the show. Again, he does take it a bit far at points, makes a lot of personal attacks, but I do think as a whole, he is an all-time great character for me. And that is why I have BB11 here at number 5. Now, number 4, we're moving on to the 2 old school seasons left on the board, and we're starting it off with Big Brother 2. And Big Brother 2 is a season that I have said many times, I do not like this season. I do think it's a season that has simply not aged well. But really, the cast is not the issue. It's really the presentation of the season and the format. However, I think the cast is actually a really fantastic one. We're really the only person out of this entire cast that I feel like is probably not that entertaining is someone like a Cheryl. But even she has some notable moments. Really, the rest of the cast is really strong. I mean, Justin, as the first person expelled, not likable, but did end up being interesting TV. And obviously the moment of "would you be mad if I killed you" is very darkly humorous. Even the likes of Autumn, who was an early boot, I think ends up being pretty notable. Shannon obviously ends up becoming a massive villainous presence across the season. Boogie is a big character early on. Kent ends up having a really interesting storyline with Bunky, who in himself is also a really interesting presence. Hardy and Nicole have an interesting dynamic together and end up being 2 massive presences across the season. Monica is a big character, though, again, to be fair, a bit under-edited. I will say Krista's kind of just fine, but she does make a deep run. But again, obviously we got to talk about Will. Will, who is an all-time great character on this season, being one of the first reality TV presences that learned how to talk to the audience. And while he does come off very douchey and cocky at points, it does obviously add to the appeal of his character. And he obviously just ends up becoming a massive legendary presence here. So again, for me, very strong cast, largely consistent cast. It's here number 4. Now number 3, same thing, but for the very next season, and that is Big Brother 3. And I will actually say that I do think Big Brother 2's cast is probably a bit more consistent. However, I do feel like Big Brother 3's cast is just more notable to me. Now, again, I will say that like the early boots in like a Tanya and even like a Lori are not as memorable as the earlier boots of Big Brother 2 to me. However, beyond that, you obviously have some really legendary figures in the likes of Danielle and Jason, who are two iconic figures, especially Daniel Reyes, who is to this day still one of the most mentioned figures in all of Big Brother. You have Marcellus, who was a really, really incredible character at the time, a groundbreaking character at the time. You have the likes of Arati, who played the game in a really interesting way that was fun to watch. You have Josh, who is a massive character that, again, has not aged well, and didn't even age well at the time, but still is a massive presence on the season. You have the likes of Kiara and Jerry and Amy, all of which who, again, like aren't like super iconic in the modern day, but definitely we got to know them pretty well across this season. And we have the winner in Lisa, who, while wasn't the most dynamic presence on TV in the world, she was extremely likable. So again, like I think as a whole, this is just a super notable cast. I feel like this is a cast that we got to know the most out of these old school Big Brother seasons, and considering the iconicness of people like Jason, Danielle, and Marcellus, it elevates it all the way to number 3 here. Now number 2, and my top 2 here actually come from 2 pretty middle school seasons of Big Brother, but at number 2, I did end up going with Big Brother 12. And 12 is one of the interesting seasons where I think its cast doesn't reflect the quality of the season, where like something like a Big Brother 23, where I think this is an all-time great cast, yet because of some stagnant gameplay, the season is more so just fine. Where here we obviously see the creation of the Brigade, and through that it ends up making the season pretty predictable. However, the cast itself is, again, really fantastic. I don't think there is a single dud on the board. Again, like I think probably the least notable figure on the season is someone like a Monet, but even she had some notable moments early on. Kathy is probably not notable in her own right, but again, like considering all the mocking of her across the season, she ends up becoming pretty fun. Even a Kirsten, who is probably one of the most riveting TV for most of it, does have a rivalry with Rachel, which is really iconic. Annie is the first boot, but she was also the saboteur, and she got a lot of screen time. Andrew Gordon was a really fun character on his way out. Obviously, Rachel Riley is a really iconic character across the season. Obviously, this is where we get the floaters, you better grab a life vest quote. And really, the final 7 on is an all-time great final 7 from a character standpoint, where probably the biggest dud on the board is the winner in Hayden, who really doesn't really lead to much riveting TV, but outside that, everyone else is fantastic. You have the likes of Lane, who I think is one of the most underrated characters in the history of the show. Reagan ends up becoming a massive presence in the back half of the season. You have Brendan, who has this big underdog run after Rachel leaves, and you have some all-time great characters in the likes of Enzo on this season, who is really fun TV. You have Brittany, who gives some of the best DRs the show has ever seen, and then you have Matt Hoffman, who becomes this very iconic villainous figure for a season. So again, like this is an all-time great cast. You have some really massive, legendary characters on this season. Again, Brittany, Rachel, Matt Hoffman, Enzo, and like really you just do not have a single dud on this season, and that's why it's here number 2. Now number 1, the best cast in the history of Big Brother US to me does end up becoming what I would also consider the best season of the show. We have Big Brother 10. And again, a lot of that is because of how great the cast is. This is another cast that does not have a single dud on the board. Mind you, I do think there are a couple less notable figures, and to be honest, probably less notable than the less notable figures from BB12. I think someone like an Angie is just really forgettable. Someone like a Steven is also probably not super notable. But I think outside that, again, all-time great cast here. Again, the first boot in Brian Hart has probably one of the biggest downfalls of any first boot in the history of the show. You have Jesse, who is a massive presence in the early game and is obviously the impetus of the Keisha's birthday fight. We do have the Coven themselves in Keisha, April, and Libra, all legendary characters for the show. Libra in particular is such a star on this season and really just brings so much entertainment to the early portion of the show. Michelle Costa also ends up becoming becoming a somewhat likable underdog figure at a point, and is also a very confrontational figure as well. Ollie, I will say, is probably like leaning on the more boring side, but even then, he has a great downfall in his trusting of Dan at the end and getting screwed over. Jerry ends up being extremely notable, where despite him being the oldest person to play Big Brother, he still ends up being a really big character across the season, getting into many confrontations. You also have Rennie, who is another really great character. And then we have the final two in Memphis and Dan, who again, Memphis is mostly just fine, though he does have an interesting run across the season. But obviously Dan, all-time great character. A player that is so willing to shake things up and goes out of his way to make good TV. And through that, again, it really just leaves us with a really legendary cast. Again, like the number of like all-time great characters on this cast are insane. Again, you have Dan, Keisha, Rennie, Libra, April, Jesse, Jerry. You can add in Michelle Costa into that. Like those are all-time great characters for the show. And when even the more boring figures and someone like an Ollie and a Memphis have a lot to do on the season by the end of it, and also us getting a all-time great first boot in Brian Hart, it really leaves this as one of the best casts the show has ever seen. It's here number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my cast ranking for Big Brother US. Now moving forward, I do still plan on doing a few pretty big Big Brother rankings. I still want to do a ranking of all the pre-juries and post-juries. I want to rank all the first HOH reigns. So those are things that might come up down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.